Welcome to Whispers in the Dark, where the shadows hold secrets too terrifying to be spoken aloud. Imagine walking through the quiet streets of a town consumed by an ancient curse, where creatures that should not exist slither in the dark. The more you uncover, the closer you get to a chilling truth, one that will haunt you forever. Will the curse ever truly end? Stay with us until the end to discover the mind-shattering twist. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispers in the Dark. Your support keeps the darkness alive and the stories coming. The town of Salem, Massachusetts, lay wrapped in an eternal fog. The mist, thick and oppressive, clung to the cobblestone streets like the whispered secrets of centuries. Salem was a town known for its sinister past, its air perpetually laden with a sense of dread, a place where darkness seemed to linger even when the sun was at its peak, the whispers of which trials and occult practices were woven into its very fabric. Yet, the residents of Salem had a quiet way of avoiding the truth. They spoke in hushed tones about the dark things that happened long ago, but there was one thing everyone agreed on. The past never truly stayed in the past. And for those who dared uncover the town's darkest secrets, there was always a price to pay. The streets of Salem were quiet, too quiet. It wasn't the quiet of peaceful townsfolk enjoying a gentle breeze, but the kind of silence that pressed against you, leaving you with the feeling that something unseen, something ancient, was watching from the shadows. The alleys were narrow, their cobblestones slick with a centuries-old patina that seemed to absorb sound and light. Every building, every structure held within it echoes of the past, ghosts that the modern-day town tried desperately to suppress. But the more you looked, the more the town revealed its true nature, chilling, haunting, and unwilling to let anyone leave unchanged. It was on one such mist-laden evening that James Wyatt arrived in Salem. A young journalist, eager and bright-eyed, James had left behind the chaos of a life that had been shattered by grief. His wife, Lena, had died in mysterious circumstances. An accident, they called it. But James knew better. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange coincidences surrounding her death. The kind of questions that gnawed at his soul every waking moment, leading him to seek refuge in Salem. After all, where better to start over than a place with such a dark, storied past? Surely, uncovering secrets was the answer, he thought. Maybe it would offer him closure, or at least the distraction he desperately needed. But Salem was no place for the faint-hearted, and James would soon discover that it had a way of pulling people into its web, trapping them in a nightmare they could never escape. James Wyatt wasn't just another journalist looking for a story. He had a different purpose, a deeper drive, one that came from the need to understand, to uncover the truth behind the eerie whispers that had haunted his every thought since Lena's death. His arrival in Salem wasn't a coincidence. It felt like destiny, though he couldn't quite explain why. The town had an energy about it, something that coursed through the mist and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up every time he stepped onto its streets. It wasn't just the history that called to him. It was something more, something darker. James had rented a small apartment in one of the older buildings, tucked away on a quiet street. His neighbors were reclusive, the kind of people who didn't ask questions and didn't want to answer them either. His first few days were spent wandering the town, familiarizing himself with the landmarks, the local shops, and the people who lived there. He quickly noticed how everyone seemed to be in a hurry to finish their business and leave. No one lingered on the streets for long. But there was one woman who stood out, Rebecca Miles, a local historian who had lived in Salem her entire life. Rebecca was a woman in her early 40s, with a sharp mind and a quiet intensity that made her both intriguing and unnerving. She was known in town as the one person who held the most knowledge about the town's occult history, but people rarely spoke to her directly about it. There was always something hidden behind her knowing eyes, a sense that she understood far more than she let on. She spoke with a calm certainty, but there was something in her voice, a subtle tremor, that suggested even she was afraid of what she knew. And it wasn't just the witch trials or the ghost stories she seemed to have an endless supply of. It was the way she spoke of the old things, the entities that had once roamed Salem's streets and, in some dark corners of the town, still did. James had heard whispers about Rebecca before he ever met her. People said she was the one to go to if you wanted to know about the town's darker side, but they also warned to be careful. Salem wasn't a town for outsiders to ask too many questions, and those who did often found themselves in over their heads. But James wasn't easily deterred. He was drawn to her knowledge, and to the secrets she kept. Their first meeting was accidental. James had ventured into the local library, a dusty old place that smelled of old paper and mildew. It was the kind of library where every book felt like it had been untouched for decades, and yet there was something oddly comforting about it. He had been browsing through a section of local history when Rebecca appeared at his side, almost as if she had been waiting for him. She was tall, with dark, straight hair that framed her face, her sharp eyes scanning him with a mix of curiosity and caution. "You're new," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge to it as though every word was measured carefully. "Looking for a good story?" James nodded, taken aback by how direct she was. "I'm looking for the truth," he replied, his voice more earnest than he intended. Rebecca's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Be careful what you wish for in Salem, Mr. Wyatt. Some truths are better left buried." Her words echoed in James's mind as she turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of aisles within the library. There was something about her, something unsettling yet magnetic, that drew him deeper into the town's mysteries. He could feel it in his bones. Something dark was lurking in Salem, and it wasn't just the history of witch trials or the old legends. It was something living, something that had never truly died. That night, as James returned to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It wasn't the normal unease of living in a new place. No, this was different. There was something in the shadows, something just out of reach, always there, just beyond the corner of his vision. In the quiet of his apartment, James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. He stood by the window, watching the mist roll through the streets below, and that's when he saw it. A shadow. It moved along the street, not like a person, but with a strange fluidity, as if it were alive. The street lamps flickered above it, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach toward him, beckoning him to follow. But James didn't follow. He froze, staring out into the darkness, heart pounding in his chest. He knew in that moment that his arrival in Salem wasn't an accident. It was the beginning of something much darker, something he wasn't ready for. And as the shadow faded into the fog, he heard it, a faint whisper as if someone was calling his name from the depths of the night. "James, James, come closer." He stepped back from the window, the feeling of being watched intensifying. The town had begun to feel less like a place to start over and more like a trap, and now James was caught in its web. This was only the beginning. The town of Salem had already worked its subtle magic on James Wyatt. He had only been there for a few weeks, but it felt as if the town had seeped into his skin, its atmosphere thick and unrelenting, like a fog that refused to lift. Every morning, the mist that clung to the cobblestone streets seemed to grow thicker, curling like ghostly fingers around his feet, urging him to follow it into the heart of the town. It was a town that wore its secrets like a shroud, and James could feel the weight of those secrets pressing down on him, drawing him ever deeper. It wasn't until he stumbled upon the journal that the first true ripple of unease began to churn inside him. The journal had been hidden in a dusty corner of the local antique shop, a forgotten relic left behind by someone who had long since faded from history. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with a stooped back and thick, yellowed glasses, had told James that it once belonged to Samuel Hawthorne, a man whose name was only whispered in the darker corners of Salem's history. Hawthorne had been one of the town's first settlers, an individual whose life was shrouded in tragedy and superstition. He was known for his research into the occult and the supernatural, a pursuit that had eventually led him down a path from which he never returned. James was intrigued. The shopkeeper seemed reluctant to speak further, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if afraid that something, might overhear. But James, driven by the same restless curiosity that had brought him to Salem in the first place, could sense that the journal held something important, something vital to understanding the mysteries of the town. The moment James opened the journal, he felt the coldness of the paper. It was as if the book had been waiting for him, its pages eager to reveal their secrets. The writing inside was scrawled in hurried, jagged script, as though the author had been in a rush, desperate to document his thoughts before he was overtaken by something. The pages were filled with fragmented entries, half-thoughts, and urgent pleas for help. Samuel Hawthorne had written about strange occurrences, things he had witnessed in Salem, things that defied explanation. As James read, the words blurred before his eyes. The deeper he went into the journal, the more unsettling the passages became. There were mentions of rituals, old, forbidden rites conducted under the cover of night, away from prying eyes. Hawthorne described unholy symbols, summoning circles drawn in blood and whispers from the dark corners of the town. But the most chilling entry, the one that seemed to dominate the last few pages, was about a creature, an ancient being, one that lived in the shadows and thrived on fear. It was as though the creature itself had been waiting for James to read those words. The first strange incident occurred that night. James had just returned to his apartment after spending hours reading the journal in the dim light of the library. He set the journal down on his desk, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was lurking in the corners of the room, just out of sight. He laughed it off, dismissing it as the remnants of the unease the journal had stirred in him. But the moment he turned off the lamp and settled into his bed, the room felt wrong. It started with a faint tapping sound, a soft, rhythmic noise that seemed to come from the far corner of the room. At first, James thought it was the wind or perhaps the old wooden beams in the ceiling creaking. But the tapping continued, faster now, more urgent. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The air in the room grew cold, so cold that his breath fogged in front of him. He turned on the lamp, but the tapping stopped. The room was eerily quiet, too quiet. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. Only the faintest outline of his own reflection in the window, distorted by the fog outside. Shaking his head, he decided it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But as he reached for the journal, he saw something else. The book, which had been lying closed on the desk, was now open. The pages were turning slowly as though someone or something was flipping through them. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and a strange, tingling sensation crawled up his spine. James leapt out of bed, his heart racing. The journal's pages stopped moving as if they had been frozen in time. But the air in the room was thick now, saturated with a presence that seemed to be pressing in on him from all sides. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. The temperature returned to normal, the tapping ceased, and the journal lay still on the desk, its pages closed once more. James was shaken, but he refused to acknowledge the terror gnawing at him. He had come to Salem to uncover the truth, to piece together the story of the town's dark past. He would not let fear stand in his way. He had to know more. But that night, sleep did not come easily. His mind raced with questions, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw the creature from the journal, a shadowy figure, its face obscured by darkness, yet its presence all-consuming. And as the hours stretched on, James could feel something else, a sense of dread, a feeling that the town was alive in a way he could not yet understand. The following morning, he found himself once again standing in front of the dusty shelves of the library, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. It was there, in the back corner, that he saw her again, Rebecca Miles. She was sitting at a wooden table reading from a thick, leather-bound book, her face partially obscured by the shadows. When James approached, she looked up, her piercing eyes meeting his with an unsettling calmness. "You've read it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. James hesitated but nodded. "Yes, I don't understand. What is this? Why did Samuel Hawthorne write about this creature? What is it?" Rebecca closed the book slowly, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the leather. "You're asking questions that no one has dared to ask for a long time, James," she said softly. "Some things are better left forgotten. There are forces in this town, dark forces, that were never meant to be uncovered. Once you begin to dig into Salem's past, there's no turning back." James felt a chill run down his spine, but his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. "I need to know," he said, his voice steady. "I can't just walk away. This town, it's hiding something." Rebecca's gaze darkened and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. This town has seen things that should have stayed buried, and now it's too late. The shadows are waking up and they won't stop until they've claimed you too." James felt his breath catch in his throat, but his resolve did not waver. "I'll take my chances," he said. "I have to know the truth." Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing his soul. Then she sighed heavily, as though resigning herself to something inevitable. "Very well," she said, "but remember this, when the shadows come for you, don't say I didn't warn you." As James left the library, the weight of Rebecca's words hung heavy in his mind. The temperature in the town had dropped again, and the mist was thicker than ever. He glanced back over his shoulder, certain that something was following him, lurking just beyond the fog. The journey into the heart of Salem's darkness had begun, and there was no turning back. Salem, Massachusetts, had always worn its dark past like a badge of pride, an eerie distinction that it could never shake off. It was a town of secrets, secrets that the townsfolk carried in hushed whispers, ones that were buried so deeply that they had almost become folklore. But for James Wyatt, these whispers were no longer just rumors. They were becoming his reality, stretching beyond the pages of the journal Samuel Hawthorne had left behind, seeping into his own life in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. It was in the heart of the library, after his conversation with Rebecca, that James first began to see the true scope of the darkness that clung to Salem. He spent hours poring over the old, yellowed books, the kind that held the town's forgotten history, papers that no one dared read, for fear of opening doors better left shut. It was there, among the forgotten tomes, that he found the first clue, an old, brittle manuscript that detailed the origins of an ancient cult, one whose name was rarely spoken aloud, even in Salem's darkest corners. The Order of the Veiled One. The manuscript was frail, its pages delicate and yellowed with age, but the ink was still sharp and clear. The words leaped off the page, chilling James to the bone. The Order of the Veiled One had once been a powerful group, operating in Salem long before the witch trials, their influence stretching across generations. The cult had believed in the summoning of dark entities, creatures from realms beyond the veil, and practiced rituals that involved human sacrifice. Their beliefs were rooted in an ancient form of necromancy, a forbidden art that called forth the spirits of the dead and bound them to the will of the living. It was said that their ceremonies were held in secret, deep within the town's darkest corners, far from the prying eyes of the law. As James read, the words began to blur together, and an unsettling sense of déjà vu crept over him. The cult's most famous and terrifying ritual was one of blood and flesh, where a living sacrifice, often an outsider, someone who wouldn't be missed, was offered to the entity they worshipped. The manuscript spoke of a terrifying being, one that was said to reside within the shadows, feeding off the fear of those who dared to summon it. The Veiled One was its name, though no one had ever truly seen its face. The more James read, the more he realized that the cult's influence had never truly dissipated. It had merely gone underground, its rituals and practices hidden in the shadows. People still whispered about it in hushed voices, but the town's history had been carefully erased, its darker chapters buried beneath layers of time and myth. No one dared speak too much about it, and anyone who ventured too close to the truth seemed to disappear. The revelations about the cult sent a shiver down James's spine, but it was what came next that made his blood run cold. The manuscript detailed how the cult's influence had reached into the very heart of Salem's government, its law enforcement, and its very fabric. The cult was not just a relic of the past, it was alive, and it had never truly left. The tendrils of its influence were still woven into the town, even if the people who lived there didn't know it. James's heart pounded in his chest as the weight of this truth settled on him. The Veiled One was not just a ghost of Salem's past, it was something far worse. It was a presence, one that had never left, and it was only a matter of time before it returned in full force. That night James lay in bed, the journal Samuel Hawthorne had left him resting on the bedside table. The weight of the day's discoveries hung heavily on him, but it was the nightmares that began to take hold of him that truly began to unravel his mind. It started with a whisper. At first it was faint, a distant sound that seemed to come from the corners of the room. But as he lay still, listening, the whispering grew louder, filling his ears with a sound that seemed both ancient and chilling. The voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, a hollow, otherworldly quality that made his skin crawl. "James, James, come closer." He jerked awake, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was suffocatingly quiet, the silence so thick that it felt like it could smother him. He glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for a night in Salem. He closed his eyes, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching him. But as he drifted back to sleep, the whispering began again. This time it was louder, closer. "James, you cannot escape." The darkness that had once been an abstract fear in the corners of his mind was now becoming a tangible presence. It wasn't just the town, it was the Veiled One. It was as if the very air in Salem had begun to warp, taking on an unnatural weight, as if something from another realm was slowly seeping into his world. The dreams that followed were no better. In one, James found himself standing in the center of a vast, dark forest. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, beckoning him forward. He could feel the coldness in the air, but it wasn't the kind of cold one felt in the dead of winter. No, this was a cold that seemed to seep into his very bones, a cold that didn't belong to this world. He walked through the forest, each step heavier than the last, until he saw it. An ancient altar, surrounded by twisted stone pillars, their surfaces carved with symbols he didn't recognize. Standing before the altar was a figure, its face obscured by a veil of shadows. But James could feel its eyes on him, staring at him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. He tried to speak, but his mouth wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure reached out to him, its hands cold and gnarled, its fingers like tendrils of darkness. And then, with a terrifying slowness, it lifted its veil. James screamed, but there was no sound. And then the veil was gone, and the face that stared back at him was not human. It was something monstrous, its eyes hollow, its mouth a twisted grin. It was the Veiled One. James woke up with a start, gasping for breath, his sheets soaked with sweat. The line between dream and reality had blurred so completely that he wasn't sure where one ended and the other began. Every time he closed his eyes, the creature's face haunted him, its hollow eyes following him wherever he went. It was as though it was calling to him, trying to drag him into its world. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't just in his dreams. It was here, in Salem, waiting for him. The town was no longer just a backdrop to his investigation. It had become the living embodiment of his nightmares, and there was no escape. The following day, Rebecca's warning echoed in James's mind. He had ignored it then, convinced that uncovering the truth would set him free, but now he wasn't so sure. Every step he took seemed to bring him closer to something dark and terrifying, something that had been waiting for him all along. As he walked through Salem's mist-laden streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that the town itself was alive, its every corner holding a secret, every shadow hiding a danger. The creatures from his nightmares were no longer just figments of his imagination. They were part of the town's dark reality, and James had only just begun to uncover the truth. The town was waking up, and so too was the Veiled One. The shadows in Salem had always seemed more than mere absence of light. They were a presence, alive and watching, lurking in the deepest corners of the town, waiting for something or someone to stumble upon them. James Wyatt had thought he understood fear when he first arrived in Salem. He had seen the townspeople skirting around the whispers of witches, of ghosts, of old curses. But fear, true fear, was something he was only beginning to grasp, and it had a shape, a shadow, and a name. It was a cold night in Salem when the shadow finally revealed itself to him. The streets were quiet, the fog thickening with each step he took toward his apartment. The usual oppressive silence hung in the air like a thick, wet blanket. But tonight there was something else. A prickling unease, a feeling that he wasn't alone. James stepped into his apartment, the old wood creaking beneath his boots, the smell of dust and old paper lingering in the air. He had grown accustomed to the eerie calm of his surroundings, to the strange, whispered noises that seemed to echo through the walls when no one was there. But tonight was different. There was an intensity to the silence, a sharpness that made his skin crawl. He set his coat on the back of a chair, and as he walked toward his desk, something caught his eye, a flicker in the corner of the room. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light or perhaps his imagination playing tricks on him. But when the flicker reappeared, this time more pronounced, he froze. The shadow moved in the corner of his room, a dark, amorphous form that shifted and stretched like a living thing. It was as if the darkness itself had taken on substance, manifesting in a shape that was almost human but not quite. It seemed to glide, moving through the walls with an unnatural grace, its presence filling the room like a dark cloud. James felt a chill spread through his body, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, but his legs refused to obey. He stood frozen, staring at the figure as it moved across the room, its form flickering in and out of focus, as though it existed between dimensions. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, pressing against him as if it was reaching into his very soul. For a long moment, the shadow simply watched him. It didn't advance, didn't retreat. It only existed, filling the space with a weight that was both suffocating and hypnotic. James could feel the air growing colder, his breath visible in the frigid space. The room seemed to close in around him, the walls drawing tighter as if the shadow was compressing the very atmosphere. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. One moment it was there, a creeping darkness in the corner of his vision, and the next it was gone, leaving behind only the faintest echo of its presence. James stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the shadow had been, his pulse hammering in his ears. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled into his bones. It had been a hallucination, he told himself. His mind had been playing tricks on him. After all, it wasn't the first time the darkness had seemed to come alive in Salem. But deep down in the pit of his stomach, James knew it wasn't a trick of the mind. The shadow was real. It was out there, watching him. The next day, James met with Rebecca Miles to continue their investigation into the cult's dark past. The shadow's presence had shaken him more than he was willing to admit, but the investigation needed to go on. There was no turning back now. He had uncovered too much, and now he was tied to Salem's history in a way that couldn't be undone. Rebecca was waiting for him in the library when he arrived, her face pale and tight with worry. She had been doing her own research into the cult, but there was something in her eyes now that told James she knew more than she was letting on. "James," she said quietly, almost as if she were afraid to speak aloud, "we need to dig deeper. There's something we're missing, something important." James nodded, his mind still reeling from the encounter with the shadow. He sat across from her, feeling the weight of her gaze on him as she slid a worn book across the table. It was a book of Salem's history, but unlike the others, this one was older, its pages delicate and fragile. As James opened it, he found entries that spoke of the Order of the Veiled One, the same cult that had once ruled Salem from the shadows. But this book told a more sinister story, one that James hadn't fully grasped before. The rituals described in the book were far darker than anything James had imagined. The cult ceremonies were said to summon the Veiled One, a being that lived in the spaces between worlds, a creature born of shadow and darkness, feeding on the fear and souls of those who dared to call upon it. But what struck James most were the mentions of a hidden chamber beneath the town, an ancient underground space where the final ritual had been performed, a ritual that had supposedly summoned the creature into the world. And according to the book, the chamber was still there, buried beneath the streets of Salem. Rebecca's voice broke through his thoughts. "This chamber," she said, her eyes scanning the page, "it's where they called forth the demon. It's still there somewhere, hidden beneath the town. And it's not just a symbol of the past, it's a part of Salem's present. The ritual never truly ended. The demon is still tied to this place." James could feel a cold sweat forming on his brow as he read the passage again. The hidden chamber was real, and if the ritual had never truly been completed, if the demon was still tied to the town, then Salem wasn't just haunted by the ghosts of its past, it was still living in the grip of something far worse. "We need to find it," James said, his voice steady despite the fear building inside him. "We need to uncover the chamber. It's the only way to understand what's really going on here." Rebecca nodded, her expression grim. "I've been looking into it. I think I know where it might be. There's a series of tunnels beneath Salem, old underground pathways that date back to the early settlers. They were used for smuggling and other, darker purposes. Together, they began to formulate a plan to search the tunnels beneath the town. But as they spoke, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That someone, was listening, waiting for them to make their move. The shadow was still out there, lurking in the corners of his mind. The further they dug into Salem's secrets, the more dangerous it became. Every step brought them closer to the truth, but also deeper into the dark heart of the town. And James knew deep down that the shadow was just the beginning. That night, as James lay in bed once more, he could feel it again. The coldness in the room, the creeping sense that something was just out of sight. He stared into the darkness, waiting for the inevitable. And then he heard it again, the whisper, low and insistent, drifting through the walls. "James, James, you cannot hide." He knew then, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that the shadow was no longer just a warning. It was a messenger, and it was telling him one thing: there was no escape from the darkness. The investigation had only just begun, and the demon was awakening. The town of Salem was no longer just a place for James Wyatt. It was a living nightmare that threatened to consume him, body and soul. With every step he took, the shadows grew longer, deeper, more suffocating. The fog, once a mere annoyance, now felt like a harbinger of something far worse. The truth he had uncovered was no longer just a piece of history. It was an active curse, an ancient malevolent force that had been unleashed by his own curiosity. The darkness he had so eagerly sought to understand was now closing in on him, its tendrils stretching into every corner of his life, threatening to tear it apart. It all began with a discovery, something he should have never found. James had been down in the basement of the old library, buried beneath piles of ancient manuscripts and forgotten tomes, when his fingers brushed against something that didn't feel like paper. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled the object free from the dust, a relic buried deep within the shelves, wrapped in brittle cloth. It was an ornate pendant, its shape twisted and unnatural, the symbol etched into its surface barely visible, obscured by time and decay. The moment his fingers made contact with the pendant, a chill surged through his body, an icy cold that made his breath catch in his throat. It was as if the pendant had been waiting for him, its dark power stirring the air around him. As he held it in his hand, the ground beneath him trembled ever so slightly. The whispering wind, once gentle, picked up speed, howling through the cracks in the library's walls. James looked up in confusion, but before he could make sense of what was happening, the room around him seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, colder. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move, stretching unnaturally, their forms writhing like living things. And the most terrifying part, he could hear them, whispers, low and guttural, like voices from another world, speaking in a language he didn't understand. He dropped the pendant immediately, but it was too late. The moment it touched the ground, the room erupted in chaos. The air felt thick with malice, as if the very walls of the library were alive, breathing in the darkness. The shadows on the walls now had form, twisting into grotesque, monstrous shapes. The flickering light from the single candle James had lit cast eerie, unnatural shadows that danced across the walls, shapes that were far too large and too hideous to be real. But they were real. The first creature emerged from the darkness with a shriek that rattled his bones. It was twisted and misshapen, its form contorted into something barely recognizable as human. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was hollowed out, eyes sunken deep into its skull, its mouth stretched in an agonizing grin. Its skin was stretched taut over its bones, pale and rotting. And as it lurched forward, the scent of decay filled the room, nauseating and overpowering. James stumbled back in horror, but the room had changed. The space was no longer just a room filled with books. It had become something far worse. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor cracking beneath his feet as the shadows solidified into creatures, spirits twisted and deformed by the rituals of the cult, their faces twisted in eternal suffering, their eyes vacant and void of life. These were the souls of the sacrifices, the ones who had been dragged into the veil by the cult's dark summoning. They had never left, and now they were free. James scrambled to his feet, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. The shadows had taken form, physical form, and they were closing in on him, their twisted limbs reaching out to grab him, to pull him into their world. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling his ears, drowning out everything else. "You've released us. You've released the Veiled One." The words echoed in his mind, a terrible realization crashing over him. He had done it. He had unknowingly activated the curse. He had unleashed the very entity that the cult had once sought to control. And now it was awake. He barely managed to escape, running out of the library and into the fog-choked streets of Salem. The air felt thick, as though the fog itself was alive, curling around him like fingers. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing against him, smothering him. He had seen the horrors of the cult, those twisted creatures that had once been human, and he had witnessed the rise of the dark forces that had been dormant for so long. But even as he ran, he knew that escaping the physical realm wasn't enough. The curse wasn't confined to the library. It was in Salem now, in the very air that he breathed. The creature, the Veiled One, had been unleashed, and its influence would spread. He could feel it, the pull of something dark and ancient, wrapping itself around him, dragging him into the abyss. Rebecca Miles had been waiting for him. She had known this day would come. She had seen the signs long before James had uncovered the pendant, long before the shadow had appeared. Rebecca had been a part of the Order of the Veiled One, a member of the occult circle that had once summoned the creature into this world. She had seen the horrors firsthand, too many to recount, but it was the rituals, the sacrifices, the things she had witnessed in that hidden chamber beneath Salem that had driven her to leave. But no one truly leaves the order, not completely. Rebecca's revelation came in a moment of shared desperation. When James finally found her, she was sitting in her small, dimly lit study, the weight of years of secrecy pressing down on her. She looked older than James remembered, her face gaunt, her eyes haunted by memories she had tried to bury. She could see it in his eyes. He had already seen too much, and now there was no turning back. "I've been waiting for you," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "You've awoken it, haven't you, the veiled one?" James nodded, his throat dry, his voice trembling. "It's real, it's here." Rebecca's eyes darkened. It never left James. The ritual was never completed. The veiled one, its power still lives, and it's tied to this town, tied to us. She paused, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I was once part of the order. I didn't know what I was truly involved in at the time. At first, it all seemed like just a means of gaining power. But the rituals, the creatures they summoned, they weren't just monsters, they were real, and I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to leave, but the curse, it didn't let me go, it followed me." James's heart pounded as he listened. "What are we supposed to do? How do we stop it?" Rebecca stood, her face hardening with resolve. "There's a way to banish the demon back to its realm, but it's not simple. It requires the ritual, the one they started but never finished. It requires a sacrifice. And I'm the one who can perform it." James felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A sacrifice. Rebecca's face twisted with regret. "Yes, a life, one willing to give itself up to close the gate, but there's more. You don't just close the gate. You have to destroy the demon's power at its source. You have to sever the connection between this world and the shadow realm." She looked at him with haunted eyes, her voice a whisper. "I don't know if we'll make it in time." The town of Salem had awakened, and with it, the curse that had been dormant for so long. The shadow that had once been a whisper was now a looming presence, stretching its tendrils throughout the town, seeking to consume everything in its path. And James and Rebecca were caught at the center of it, caught in the terrifying realization that there was only one way to stop the curse from consuming everything. But in order to do that, they would have to confront the horrors of the past and the demons that had been summoned so long ago. The darkness was awakening, and it was hungry. The fog in Salem had thickened, twisting itself into an almost living thing. It moved in the streets like a predator stalking its prey, tendrils of mist creeping into every corner of the town, wrapping around every building, every person, until nothing remained untouched. The people of Salem, once proud and stoic in the face of their haunted history, now moved through the streets like shadows of themselves, their faces drawn, eyes hollow, reflecting the terror that had begun to consume their very souls. James Wyatt and Rebecca Miles had only begun to scratch the surface of the horror that had gripped the town. They had uncovered the truth, the ancient cult, the unholy rituals, the shadowy creatures that had been unleashed, but they were too late. The darkness was no longer confined to the pages of dusty books or the whispers of old legends. It was alive, it was here, and it was coming for them. The night had become a living nightmare. James could feel the weight of it on his chest, the suffocating presence of something ancient and malicious closing in on him. He and Rebecca had only just begun to understand what they were up against, and yet they were already running out of time. The town was being consumed from within, and with every passing hour the creatures, the very shadows of Salem, seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. It was as if the town itself was no longer a place but a living entity, slowly turning to dust as it fed off the fear and despair of its inhabitants. "We can't stay here," Rebecca said, her voice strained, her eyes wide with a fear James had never seen before. "The longer we wait, the stronger it gets. The shadows are feeding on us. They're not just after our lives. They want our souls." James nodded grimly, feeling the truth of her words settle like cold stone in his stomach. He had seen the creatures, the twisted beings that had crawled from the shadows to haunt him, to torment him. They were nightmares given flesh, shapeless horrors that whispered his name, that slithered through walls, that existed in the space between light and dark. And he knew deep down that they weren't just hunting him. They were hunting them all. Every soul in Salem was a part of the sacrifice. The plan was clear, but it was a death sentence. The only way to end this nightmare was to destroy the heart of the demon, the source of its power. And to do that, they would need to find the hidden chamber beneath the town, the place where the final ritual had taken place. The chamber was a cryptic mystery, buried beneath layers of secrets and curses, but Rebecca believed she knew where it was, somewhere deep in the forgotten catacombs beneath the town's foundations. Every step they took brought them closer to the heart of the demon, but also closer to madness. The night they set out toward the catacombs was the darkest James had ever known. The moon was veiled behind a shroud of clouds, and the streets of Salem were empty, eerily so, as if the very town had been abandoned. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind or the distant rustle of leaves. But James could hear it now, the sound of something moving in the dark, something watching, waiting for them to falter. "We're too close," Rebecca whispered as they approached the entrance to the tunnels beneath the town. "It can feel us." James didn't need to ask what she meant. The sense of foreboding that had settled in his gut had grown stronger with each passing minute. It was as if the very earth beneath his feet was alive, pulsing with dark energy. The shadows, the creatures that lurked in the fog, were closing in, and they had only one chance to stop it all. If they failed, Salem would be lost forever. The catacombs were colder than James had imagined. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old stone, but there was something else, too, something acrid, like the smell of decay. The further they descended into the depths, the more James could feel the presence of the darkness. It was as though the very walls were alive, closing in around them, pushing them forward into the heart of the nightmare. Rebecca led the way, her face pale and set in grim determination. She had been down here before, in the days when she had been a part of the occult circle, when she had helped to summon the creatures that now plagued the town. She had seen the horrors with her own eyes, and she had turned away. But now there was no turning back. "This is it," she said, stopping in front of a massive stone door, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering light of their torches. "This is the entrance to the chamber where it all began, where the Veiled One was brought into this world." James swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the air around them, thick and oppressive, as if the very chamber was waiting to swallow them whole. The shadows seemed to gather at the edges of the room, flickering in the corners of his vision. Rebecca turned to him, her eyes full of sorrow and regret. "James, what happens here, what we do to destroy it, will change everything. We're not just closing a door to the past. We're erasing it, sealing away a nightmare that's been here far too long." James nodded, his pulse quickening. "I'm ready." And with that, they entered the chamber. Inside, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. The air felt heavy with the weight of centuries of darkness, as though every inch of the room was soaked in the blood of the cult's rituals. The walls were covered in faded paintings, grotesque scenes of twisted creatures and human sacrifices. The center of the room was dominated by a massive stone altar, dark stains still visible on the surface, remnants of the blood spilled during the original ritual. And there, standing at the foot of the altar, was the heart of the demon. It was not a single being, but a swirling mass of shadow, an amorphous nightmare that twisted and writhed, its form never fully solidifying. The air around it vibrated with an unnatural energy, its presence seeping into James's very bones. It was a creature born of pure darkness, an entity that fed on fear, pain, and despair. And as it turned its gaze toward them, James felt the weight of its hatred pressing against him, the pull of its power threatening to drag him into the abyss. "This is it," Rebecca said, her voice barely a whisper. "The heart of the demon, the source of everything. If we don't destroy it now, Salem will fall. The darkness will consume everything." James could feel his mind slipping, the room spinning around him. The power of the demon was overwhelming, filling the chamber with a cold, suffocating pressure. The shadows seemed to move on their own, reaching out, whispering his name, urging him to give in, to join them. But he couldn't. Not now, not when they were so close. Rebecca stepped forward, her eyes locked on the swirling mass of darkness. She reached into her coat, pulling out a small, silver dagger, ancient, its blade inscribed with runes that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The blade was the key to closing the rift, to severing the demon's connection to this world. James felt his heart racing as Rebecca raised the dagger above her head, the weight of the moment sinking in. He didn't know if they could do this. He didn't know if they could survive. The demon's presence was suffocating, its power overwhelming. But they had no choice. Rebecca plunged the dagger into the heart of the demon. The world exploded. James screamed as the darkness closed in around him, the chamber shaking violently. The shadows tore at him, pulling him down, twisting his mind. But even as the demon's power threatened to engulf them, James held onto one thing, their chance to stop it. With a final, desperate cry, the shadows began to dissipate, fading back into the darkness from which they had come. The chamber trembled, the walls cracking as the rift between the worlds began to close. But James could feel the cost of their actions, the cost of facing the darkness, the toll it had taken on them both. And as the last of the shadows faded, as the demon was sealed away once more, the silence that followed was deafening. They had done it. But James knew this was only a temporary victory. The darkness had been banished for now, but the heart of the demon still pulsed in the depths of Salem. And it would return. It always did. The battle for survival was far from over. The air in Salem had grown thick with fear, the kind of fear that dripped from the walls of the town's ancient buildings like the sweat of the damned. The fog had deepened, settling in the streets like a living thing, an insidious creature that slithered through every crack and crevice, clinging to the bones of the town. The people of Salem, broken and hollow, moved through the streets with a quiet desperation, their eyes wide with the terror of knowing that something unspeakable was watching them, waiting for the moment when it would finally rise from the depths. For James Wyatt, this terror had become a constant presence, a shadow that had followed him from the very first day he stepped into Salem's cursed streets. He had thought he understood fear, but now, as he stood at the edge of the abyss, he realized just how little he had known. The horrors that had unfolded before him were not just the product of an ancient cult, nor were they merely the remnants of a long-forgotten ritual. They were alive, alive in a way that defied explanation, reaching out from the darkness to consume everything in their path. And it was up to James to stop it. Rebecca Miles had led him to this moment. She had known what had to be done from the very beginning. The final ritual, the one that would close the portal between realms, the one that would sever the connection between the living world and the nightmare that had been summoned, was within their reach. But there was a price, and it was a price neither of them had been prepared to pay. The ritual, as Rebecca had explained, was the only way to stop the demon from fully breaking free from its prison. The heart of the demon had been severed, but its essence, the part of it that clung to Salem, that fed off the fear and despair of its inhabitants, still remained. The portal between realms was still open, and as long as it remained so, the darkness would continue to spread. James had thought he understood the nature of the ritual, but as the time to perform it drew near, the weight of its truth began to settle heavily on him. The ritual required a willing sacrifice, a life given freely without resistance to close the portal for good. And it was this sacrifice, this ultimate offering, that would ensure the demon's imprisonment. But as the pieces of the ritual fell into place, James realized the unthinkable. Rebecca was the one who would have to make that sacrifice. They stood in the heart of the chamber, the air thick with the weight of what was about to transpire. The walls of the underground room, ancient and covered in cryptic symbols, seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The altar, once stained with blood, now sat in silence, awaiting its final purpose. The ritual had begun, and there was no turning back. Rebecca stood before him, her face pale but resolute, her eyes meeting his with a sadness that seemed to span lifetimes. "James," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have to do this. It's the only way. It's the only way to stop the demon, the only way to save Salem." James felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he looked at her. He could see the determination in her eyes, the pain that had been buried deep inside her for so long. But he could also see something else, a fear, raw and unspoken, that twisted in her chest. She had known what this ritual would cost from the very beginning. She had known that she would have to sacrifice herself. "No," James replied, his voice shaking. "I can't. Rebecca, please, I won't let you do this." But Rebecca simply shook her head, her expression unwavering. "It has to be me, James. I knew it the moment I came back to this town. The moment I picked up the pieces of my past, I knew this was what had to be done. I knew this day would come." James reached out to her, his hand trembling, but she stepped back, her expression filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. "You didn't know this, but I was a part of the Order of the Veiled One. I was there when they summoned the demon, when they opened the portal for the first time. And I was the one who helped bring it into this world." James's heart skipped a beat as he heard the words he never thought he would hear. The confession hit him like a wave, drowning him in its weight. She had been part of the cult, the very cult that had set this nightmare in motion, the very cult that had condemned Salem to its fate. But even as the shock coursed through him, Rebecca continued, her voice tight with emotion. "I left, James. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live with what I had done. But the demon, it doesn't just forget. It's been waiting for me, waiting for us to finish what was started. And now I'm the only one who can stop it. The sacrifice has to be me." James's mind spun as he tried to process her words. "No, Rebecca," he said, his voice desperate. "There has to be another way. We can find another way. I can't lose you." Rebecca's eyes softened, her hand reaching out to touch his cheek. "James, this is the only way. Don't you understand? I've known it all along. The darkness has been inside me, inside all of us, since the moment we called it into this world. And now, I'm the one who must end it." The room seemed to close in on them as Rebecca stepped toward the altar, her face now a mask of quiet acceptance. "I've lived with this curse for so long, James. But if I don't do this, if I don't end it now, Salem, this place, this town, and everyone in it will be lost." James's breath caught in his throat as the weight of her words sank in. The ritual was about to begin, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The shadows that had once seemed distant were now closing in on him, filling the chamber with a suffocating presence. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping rapidly as the demon's power began to surge. He could feel it, the pull of its hunger, the weight of its evil, drawing closer with every passing second. "Rebecca," James whispered, his voice breaking, "please." But Rebecca had already begun the incantation. Her voice, low and melodic, filled the chamber as she chanted the words she had known for so long. The symbols on the altar began to glow, their power awakening, and the ground beneath them trembled with the energy of the ritual. James could feel the air shift, the very fabric of reality bending as the portal began to open once more, this time to seal the demon away forever. But the demon fought back. The darkness swirled around them, an oppressive force that pushed against the walls, trying to tear the ritual apart. The air crackled with energy as the Veiled One's presence grew stronger, its power reaching into the very heart of the chamber. The shadows twisted and writhed, becoming more solid, more tangible with each passing moment. James reached out to Rebecca, but the shadows were already closing in, pulling him back, dragging him away from her. The creature, the demon, was trying to stop them. It wanted to break free. And then, with one final scream, Rebecca plunged the ritual knife into her own chest. The room fell silent. James's heart stopped as he watched her fall to the ground, the life draining from her body. The shadows retreated, the air around them growing still, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the darkness had finally been quelled. But as he knelt beside her, as her blood soaked into the ancient stones of the altar, James knew that their battle was far from over. Rebecca had made the ultimate sacrifice, but the demon's influence still lingered, its grip on the town still strong. The ritual had been completed, but at what cost? Salem was not yet saved. The portal was closed, but the darkness had been left behind, a wound that would never fully heal. And James, alone in the ruins of the ritual, could only wonder, had Rebecca truly ended it, or had she merely delayed the inevitable? The darkness would return. And this time it would be even stronger. The ground trembled beneath James's feet as he knelt at the altar, heart racing, mind unraveling. Every breath felt labored, heavy with the weight of what had come before him, and what was yet to come. The ritual, the one that was supposed to seal the demon away for good, was reaching its climax. The energy in the chamber had become unbearable, like a storm pushing against the fabric of reality itself, pulling them both toward the edge of oblivion. Rebecca, her body bruised and bloodied, stood before the altar with eyes locked on the incantations carved into the stone. The sacrifice had been made, but the demon had not yet been fully contained. Its power, dark and endless, surged beneath their feet, rattling the very bones of the earth. James could feel it now, pulsing in the walls, in the air, the presence of something ancient and terrifying, pressing its way into this world with a ferocity that made him want to run, to flee. to escape the horrors that were being born before his very eyes. But there was no escape. The shadows had begun to churn at the edges of the room, swirling like smoke, and as the ritual reached its peak, the air itself seemed to crack open. A distant, guttural growl rumbled from the depths of the chamber, and then with a force that shattered the stillness, the Veiled One emerged from the shadows. It was no longer a mere whisper, a flicker in the darkness. It was here. It was real, and it was far worse than anything James could have ever imagined. The creature's form materialized from the darkness like an ancient nightmare brought to life, its shape fluid, made of writhing shadows and flames that flickered and danced, swirling together into something grotesque and incomprehensible. It was enormous, its towering figure filling the chamber with its presence. A towering behemoth of pure fear, its eyes burning like molten fire, its face a hideous distortion of every fear James had ever known, every terror he had ever tried to suppress. Its features were fluid, ever-changing, as if it were a nightmare that took form from the very recesses of his mind, manifesting itself as a grotesque reflection of his deepest, darkest thoughts. The face, if it could even be called a face, was twisted and contorted, its eyes hollow, bleeding with an unearthly darkness. It opened its mouth, and the air around them became thick with its ancient hunger. The very walls of the chamber began to pulse with its dark energy, shaking, quivering, as if they too were alive and afraid. The beast didn't speak. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to fill the room with a deafening roar of silence, a silence that pressed down on James, suffocating him with the weight of its malevolence. The creature was not just the embodiment of darkness. It was the very thing that would consume Salem, consume everything, if given the chance. The portal between realms was wide open now, and the demon was free to break through. Rebecca turned to James, her eyes wide with terror, yet there was a quiet resolve in her gaze. Her breath was ragged, but she stood firm, the weight of the ritual still heavy on her shoulders. She had known this was coming. She had known that this would be the end. "James," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady, "it has to be me. I'm the only one who can finish this." James's heart stopped. What do you mean?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. Rebecca's face twisted in sorrow, the weight of everything she had done, everything she had been part of bearing down on her. "The demon. It was always meant to be me, James. It's the price for the rituals I helped to set in motion. I knew this moment would come. I knew that one day I would have to be the one to seal it away." "No, Rebecca, no. There has to be another way," James pleaded, his voice breaking, his hands trembling as he reached for her. "We can find another way. I won't let you." But she shook her head, her eyes locking with his, filled with a sad understanding that made his chest ache. "There is no other way," she said softly, placing her hand on his cheek, her touch cold but comforting. "This is how it ends. This is how it has to end." The demon's growls grew louder, its massive form shifting and rippling in the darkness as if it were trying to break free from the very walls of the chamber. The ground shook beneath them as its power grew, the air thick with its hunger. Rebecca stepped forward, her body shaking with the effort of holding herself together, but her resolve unbroken. "James," she whispered, "I love you, but this is the only way." With those words, she turned back to face the altar, her arms raised high. The incantation was still hanging in the air, the final words that would seal the demon away, but it would require a life, her life. The ritual had to be completed, and the demon had to be banished. As Rebecca began to speak the final words of the incantation, The demon's howls grew louder, deafening in their intensity. The flames of its eyes flickered like burning coals, and its twisted form lunged forward, reaching for them for her. But Rebecca didn't falter. The words spilled from her mouth, ancient and powerful, her voice trembling with the weight of sacrifice. The walls of the chamber cracked, the shadows screaming as the demon writhed in pain. The power of the ritual surged through her, and James could feel the ground shaking beneath them. The very fabric of reality seemed to twist as the demon fought to break free. And then, with one final scream, Rebecca plunged the dagger into her own heart. The chamber exploded in light. James screamed as the air around him burned with the energy of the ritual. The ground beneath him splitting as if the earth itself were being torn apart. The light was blinding, overwhelming, filling every corner of the room with its intense, purifying force. And through it all, James could hear Rebecca's voice, fading the last echo of her sacrifice. The demon's roar cut through the chamber like a final, desperate cry, and then silence. James collapsed to the ground, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the ritual, his mind spinning with the chaos that had unfolded in those final moments. The air was still, the chamber now empty, save for the cold remnants of what had once been the demon's presence. The shadows that had filled the room were gone, their twisted forms dissolved into nothingness, and Rebecca, he turned to look at her. Her body lay still, blood pooling beneath her. The light from the ritual had faded, leaving the chamber in a dark, suffocating quiet. James crawled to her side, his hands trembling as he reached out to her, but there was no response. She was gone. The price had been paid. Salem was silent. The darkness that had threatened to consume the town had been sealed away, but at a terrible cost. The town was still, as though holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come. The demon had been banished, but the scars of its existence remained. The air was thick with the weight of the sacrifice, the blood of the ritual still hanging in the air. James stood there, alone in the ruins of the chamber, the weight of what had transpired pressing down on him like 1,000 tons. He had lost her. The woman who had sacrificed herself to save them all, the woman he had come to love. And as he stood there, the last remnants of the demon fading into the distance, he realized that Salem would never be the same. The darkness had been sealed, but the damage had already been done. The town of Salem would remain in ruins, forever scarred by the horrors that had been unleashed. The demon was gone, but its presence lingered in the very air, in every shadow, in every corner of the town. And as James walked away from the altar, the weight of Rebecca's sacrifice heavy on his soul, he knew one thing for certain. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. For darkness is never truly gone. It simply waits. Salem had changed. The town James returned to years after the ritual was a shadow of its former self. The once vibrant streets were now nearly empty, the stores boarded up, the houses abandoned, their windows staring vacantly out into the fog. It was a place caught between the past and the present, haunted by memories of its dark history, but also something darker that lingered still, something that would never leave. The fog, once a mysterious feature of the town, had become a constant presence, a suffocating blanket that refused to lift. The streets that had been full of life now lay eerily silent, as if the soul of Salem had been drained away, leaving behind only a hollow, forgotten place. James walked through the town like a ghost, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The weight of what had happened here, of what he had lost, pressed down on him with every step. He had thought that by sealing the demon, by sacrificing Rebecca, He had ended the nightmare. But as he walked through the streets past the old library and the darkened alleyways where shadows seemed to gather, he knew deep down that the demon's influence had never truly been banished. It had merely been buried, and like all things buried, it had a way of returning. The townspeople had whispered about it when James first arrived back in Salem. They spoke in hushed tones, as if the mere mention of the past might wake the sleeping horrors that lay beneath the surface. They had told him the town had tried to heal, tried to move on from the horrors that had unfolded all those years ago. But they couldn't escape it. No one could. The remnants of the cult's influence still lingered in the air, like a dark stain that no amount of time could ever wash away. There were stories of things seen in the corners of rooms, of shadows that moved when no one was there, of whispers carried on the wind. The demon had been sealed, but its presence, its power, had not been fully contained. There were still those who felt its pull, still those who saw its eyes in the dark. James had come back to Salem with the hope of finding peace. He thought that by returning, by facing the town that had been the epicenter of his nightmare, he could finally put everything behind him. But as he stood in the center of the town square, staring at the old church where the final ritual had been performed, he knew that peace would never come. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. It was as though the very town was holding its breath, waiting for something. James could feel it, the same presence that had haunted him all those years ago, the same dark force that had followed him since the moment he had uncovered the truth about the cult. He had thought he had destroyed it, but now, standing here in the remnants of the place where everything had started, he realized that the demon was not gone. It was watching him. James returned to his apartment, the same one he had stayed in all those years ago, though it now felt like a prison. The walls, once filled with the sounds of life and hope, now felt hollow, suffocating. As he sat by the window staring out into the fog, memories of the past flooded his mind, of Rebecca's sacrifice, of the demon's terrible form, of the ritual that had nearly destroyed them all. He could still hear her voice, still feel her touch, and yet she was gone. The town had taken her, but it had taken more than that. As the days passed, James began to notice something he hadn't seen before. The shadows were different now, darker, more insistent. They moved when he wasn't looking, just at the edge of his vision, always out of reach. He would turn to look, and there would be nothing there, just the quiet, the oppressive silence of Salem. But he could feel it. The darkness was close, closer than ever. And then, one night, it happened. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart racing. The shadows in his room had taken on a life of their own. They moved in ways that didn't make sense, curling and writhing like living things. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the room itself was alive and watching him. He tried to move, to scream, but his body felt paralyzed. The darkness had returned, and it was coming for him again. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the darkness never truly left Salem. James began to hear whispers in the streets, murmurs of people feeling watched, of strange dreams and unexplained occurrences. Some said it was the ghost of Rebecca, still lingering, still trapped in the town. But James knew better. This was something older, something far worse. The demon had been sealed away, yes, but its essence, its power, had never truly disappeared. It had merely been contained, forced back into the shadows where it had waited, patient, for the right moment to rise again. And James knew deep down that the moment had come. The town was never going to be free. As the years passed, James tried to leave, tried to move on from the horrors of Salem. But the darkness had already seeped into his soul, and no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape it. The demon's curse had followed him, a part of it forever etched into his very being. And one night, while walking through the quiet streets of Salem, he felt it, the presence, the pull. He turned a corner, his breath shallow, and there it was. The shadow, just out of reach, standing at the edge of the fog. It wasn't the same as before, but it was there, watching him, waiting. And for the first time since the ritual, James understood the truth. The demon hadn't just taken Salem, it had taken him too. The legacy of Salem would never be erased. The demon, though sealed, would never truly be gone. It had left its mark on the town, on every soul that had lived there. And now it had left its mark on James. As he stood in the fog, staring into the darkness, he realized that the curse would never end. It would never be broken. The demon would return again and again, feeding on the fear, feeding on the shadows, until the town was nothing more than a hollow shell. And as the fog closed in around him, James felt a chill deep in his bones. He knew the truth now. Salem was never meant to be saved. It was only ever meant to burn. And so the nightmare continued. Forever. The story of James Wyatt and the cursed town of Salem is one of horror, sacrifice, and the haunting consequences of actions taken in desperation. What began as a simple investigation into the dark past of a small town spiraled into a battle for survival against forces far beyond human comprehension. James, along with Rebecca, tried to end the nightmare, to close the portal between worlds that had been cracked open by ancient rituals and dark forces. They succeeded in banishing the demon, but the cost was devastating. Rebecca gave her life to close the curse, leaving behind a broken town and a shattered soul. The darkness, though sealed, never truly disappeared. It lingered, and in the end it claimed James as well. Salem's redemption was never fully realized. The curse, a malevolent force, may have been stopped for now, but it was never truly gone. Its essence remained within the town, inside James, and in the air they breathed. The horror had not ended, it had only evolved. The shadows, the whispers, and the nightmares would return, forever feeding on the fear and despair that still lived in Salem's soul. The story is a reminder of the deep cost of tampering with forces we don't understand, and the dangers of seeking knowledge without fully grasping the consequences. Even with the best intentions, some things are better left undiscovered, as some doors are better left closed. James and Rebecca's tragic tale is a cautionary one about the perils of chasing after forbidden truths, and the ultimate price of those who seek to control what was never meant to be controlled. The shadow of the demon, the lingering curse, and the irreversible destruction that follows one's actions are elements that stretch beyond Salem's boundaries. They remind us of the ghosts of our own lives, the lingering regrets, and the emotional burdens that we carry. From James and Rebecca's story, we learn that there are consequences to every action, especially when we dabble with things beyond our understanding. It teaches us the importance of caution, of respecting boundaries, and of knowing when to stop. In our personal lives, many of us find ourselves digging into the past, seeking answers to things better left undisturbed, whether it's unresolved trauma, guilt, or the pursuit of knowledge at the cost of peace. While seeking understanding can sometimes bring resolution, it can also stir up forces we may not be prepared to handle. The story urges us to be aware of the cost of knowledge and the sacrifices we make in pursuit of it. It's crucial to balance curiosity with respect for what is unknown, to know when to step back, and when to accept that some things are beyond our control. Just as in Salem, where the rituals summoned a force too great to handle, our lives are filled with moments where we must choose what to engage with and what to let go. It's about recognizing that we are not always in control and accepting the need for wisdom over reckless pursuit. What do you think of James and Rebecca's journey? Do you believe there are truths that are better left buried, or is it our nature to seek the deepest, most forbidden knowledge? How do you think we can apply the lessons from their story to our own lives? We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Comment below to share them with everyone. Don't forget to subscribe. If you found this journey through darkness captivating, please subscribe to Whispers in the Dark to support the channel. Your support helps us continue creating content that keeps you on the edge of your seat, and it motivates us to bring you even more thrilling, thought-provoking stories. Thank you for being part of this journey into the unknown.